Well, hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Hickey. I'll be talking today about forest insects of the Western U.S. I'd like to first thank Marty for the invitation to speak and also for accommodating, well, both remote participation, which is appreciated, as well as my teaching schedule. So I'd like to first thank my collaborators and funding agencies. There's been many over the course of the last several years, and so I don't have time to name them all, but I do appreciate them. So I'm going to cover a number of case studies, examples, mostly from my lab, but pulling in some other studies from other folks as well to illustrate some concepts. Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'll be discussing the climate influences on forest insects in terms of range expansion, as well as what I'm calling here intensification, which means more frequent outbreaks, a greater extent of outbreaks, or more mortality or damage within outbreaks. I'll try and illustrate that in some cases, climate influences and importance is known, but in cases of important insects, it's not very well known. And then I'll finish up with some challenges for producing future projections. Again, I'll be describing some case studies for the Western US. Most of these are historical case studies, that is, of observed insects trying to understand the role of climate. And I'll be discussing mostly native insects with one exception. To start out, I'll show you the importance of biotic agents that cause tree mortality in the Western US. We analyzed the Forest Service aerial detection surveys and produced something called mortality area, which is the area occupied by killed trees. That's the time series on the left. You can see that every year since the early 2000s, or almost every year, there's been elevated mortality of 100,000 hectares or more. If you sum that up over all the years, the cumulative mortality is about 5.5 million hectares, or 13 million acres, or about 6% of the total forested area in the Western US. Bark beetles are responsible for 94% of this mortality. As you can see from the table on the left, this is ordered by mortality area, and this is the top 10, and the top 9 are basically bark beetles. And I'm going to be talking about those in red. So most of those are bark beetles. The last one there, flathead fur borer, is a wood borer. And you can see that mountain pine beetle is the agent with the greatest mortality area, or caused the greatest amount of mortality, 2 million hectares. So I'll start with that and discuss poleward range expansion. This map shows a number of different things. In the gray stippling, what's mapped was the recent range of mountain pine beetle up to maybe 2000. Overlaid on that in green hatching is an important host, lodgepole pine, which extends northward beyond the northward range of the mountain pine beetle, which is basically central BC. And despite this host availability at northern limits, the beetle was previously confined to central BC because of very cold conditions in the winter that affected beetle survival, but also generation time. However, in the last outbreak that was in the mid-2000s, it was observed that the beetle was moving northward into this red-hatched area, which is a novel host, jack pine, that was previously known to be a suitable host, but mountain pine beetle hadn't been documented in this host previously. But the current edge of the mountain pine beetle front, if you will, is in eastern Alberta. And so, of course, there's a lot of concern by Canadian foresters that once the beetle makes it into the boreal forest and the jack pine habitat, it's going to move eastward across Canada. And US foresters are also concerned because there are suitable pine hosts on the East Coast, And therefore, if the beetle can utilize the jack pine to expand its range eastward, it may then move into the warmer conditions in the US forest. So there's a lot of concern about this movement. In addition, the mountain pine beetle has been intensifying at its upper range limit. White bark pine is a suitable host, and that occurs at the highest elevations in the Northern Rockies and in Canada. Outbreaks in the past have been recorded, but during the mid-2000s, there was extensive mortality, as shown by this map. The red areas are areas of mortality caused by mountain pine beetle and white bark pine. So my student Polly Biot wanted to do some investigation about this. So she studied the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And what she did was to develop a statistical model that included the major mechanisms that we think cause or influence outbreaks of mountain pine beetle. And this is important because we utilized the past understanding. That is, there's been a significant amount of past research that have identified mechanisms. We were able to incorporate that information to develop a pretty good statistical model. So once that model was developed, Polly used it to diagnose the influence on past outbreaks, that is the one in the 2000s. She found that warmer winters and drought over the course of several years allowed populations to build and create that large-scale mortality event. But then she also used the model to project the influence of future climate, isolating only climate, and noted that warmer winters in the future, as expected, will create a more favorable climate for mountain pine beetle, but that is affected somewhat by precipitation, so that there was some variability among the global climate model results, whereby wetter model results led to slightly less climate favorability, and drier model results led to enhanced climate favorability. Turning now to another intensification event of Western pine beetle. That beetle caused lots of mortality in conjunction with a major drought in California in 2012 to 2015 or later. Robbins et al. Published a paper recently whereby they developed a nice advanced mechanistic model that included the major components or drivers of these outbreaks. So not only climate, but something about the stand structure and tree information and susceptibility, and encapsulated this all in this nice model that they then used to test two different things. One, they looked at the role of recent warming, that is during this drought period, compared to the temperatures earlier in the 1900s. And then they assessed which of the two influences of warming were most important. That is, one on volcanism and the second on winter survival. And what they found was that the warming in the 2012, 2015 time period caused a 29% increase in pine mortality. And that was principally due to this volcanism. The warming allowed an extra generation per year. And that winter survival was much less important, principally because these locations are already warm enough such that winter survival wasn't that important to begin with. But they didn't test the effect of the drought. The drought caused host stress, of course, that led to more susceptible conditions. So that might be an avenue of future research. Turning now to another intensification event, fir engraver has been recorded as in outbreak status in the past. However, there's been a series of elevated mortality events since 2015, as illustrated by this time series. And this bark beetle typically attacks true firs, that is grand fir and white fir conditions, That was the second most important damage agent in the Western US that caused mortality. So it really has caused a lot of mortality since 2015. That was coincident with some major drought events, the one I just mentioned already in California, but also mortality in Oregon and to some degree in Washington. And both of these areas or time periods were associated with drought events. And so, like when many bark beetles, drought is thought to be an important influence, but we really don't have a quantitative measure of or ability to predict or project outbreaks given drought. So I'm currently working on a project to look at that in a little more detail, and I'm struggling a little bit. These figures show on the x-axis climatic water deficit, where greater values indicate drier conditions. The y-axis is mortality caused by fur engraver. The numbers indicate years. So here's a progression from 2018 to 2019 to 2020 to 2021. And two areas. One is Central Oregon, the other is Sierra Nevada and California. A couple of things to note from these figures. One, the R-square is pretty low. So right off the bat, there's not a very nice or at least linear relationship. The second is for a given level of climatic water deficit, you can see quite a range of mortality, so that, again, drought by itself is not necessarily a good predictor of mortality. And then the second is that if you note that there's increases in mortality as conditions progress from wetter to drier, so 2017 to 2018, same thing, 2020 to 2021, as you would expect, drying conditions lead to more mortality. But if you look over here on the Sierra Nevada, there was this opposite effect, such that increases in mortality occurred with wetter conditions. So it's pretty confusing. I think what's going on is a combination of needing to consider the insect populations, the prior insect populations, also needing to consider multiple years and not just the immediate year's effect. And then maybe some finer resolution analysis will help with this. The next two examples might be considered emerging threats. One is Western cedar bark beetle, which typically attacks incense cedar in California. It has been documented in giant sequoias, but at very low population levels and as a result, very low damage levels. However, during this drought that I've already mentioned in California, there was a notable giant sequoia dieback, canopy dieback, and mortality, in which there were greater populations of this beetle measured and associated damage. So it's thought that this beetle has combined with drought, certainly, and perhaps fire damage to increase the damage and mortality of this iconic tree species. So there's a lot of concern about this, not only because sequoias are iconic and people like to go and see them, but they also have a very limited population and range. And so it won't take much of a disturbance event or mortality event to knock back populations pretty significantly. And another, so that's not the only emerging threat. This is the wood borer called flat-headed fir borer, which attacks and kills Douglas firs. It has also been recorded in the past, but effectively the damage has been very limited. So this time series actually goes back to 1947 in Oregon and Washington, and you can see the major ramp up in mortality in the last couple of years. This mortality has principally happened in southwestern Oregon. And a preliminary paper on this that looked at some early analyses or early amounts of mortality showed that increasing climatic water deficit here along the y-axis was associated with higher mortality, that is, higher damage classes. So we're about to start a project that uses more recent data and some refined statistical analysis to see if we can tease out this, this effect. The last two examples here are associated with uncertainty about the role of climate in some important insects. I'm moving now to an important defoliator. This is Western spruce budworm. The time series across the top shows the damage area in millions of hectares in the US and Canada. The US is in this dotted line. You can see during the 1980s, there was millions of hectares every year that were damaged by this defoliator. I'll just note that like many defoliators, these insects don't necessarily cause mortality, but with heavy defoliation over multiple years, the trees can die. So the hosts here are mainly Douglas fir, but many different conifers are actually hosts as well. So multiple studies in the past have identified multiple drivers that include climate. However, these are often opposing. So temperature, precipitation, and the combination leading to drought has been identified. The timing of these changes, whether it's winter, spring, summer, or fall, have all been identified as potentially important and significant influences on Western spruce budworm populations. And these influences affect both, well, all of the outbreak initiation, the maintenance of an outbreak, and its termination. So it's a complicated system. And to date, there's not been really a study that has looked at which of these factors are most important, or at least important in driving the large-scale mortality events, and whether there's been some spatial variability associated with that might be hiding some of this complexity. So to illustrate that, I'm going to show you just one aspect, and that's the role that drought may play on initiating outbreaks. And I'm going to show you studies that mostly rely on dendrochronology, that is tree ring analysis, also some statistical analysis and modeling. So this is a map that just shows the distribution of Douglas fir and other host species, just for illustration. But I wanted to show you that there is spatial variability in this and this effect. So in the north and northwest, as well as in southern British Columbia, it appears that drier conditions promote the outbreak initiation. But in the southwestern US, it appears that wetter conditions promote outbreak initiation. And to add on to that, a couple of my graduate students have looked using aerial surveys, as well as some dendrochronological studies that are separated by elevation, and they've found very little effect of drought on outbreak initiation. So it's pretty uncertain in this particular instance, but also among all the drivers, which seems to be important. Turning now to the last case study, this is Balsam Willia delgid, which is an invasive forest insect. In the western US, you can see the reds indicate some distribution as of 2006. In the west, the first recordings were in the 1920s. This insect attacks and can kill true firs, grand fir and white fir at lower elevations, subalpine fir at higher elevations. It attacks all size classes, and like the defoliator I just mentioned, doesn't necessarily cause mortality, but can when infestations are severe enough. And there's a lot of concern about the expansion of Balsam Willia delgid into subalpine fir forests in the western US. So a few years ago, there was a paper published that looked at this risk for subalpine fir. These authors used some plot data to develop a statistical model of this climate-based risk, which identified May temperature and precipitation and September temperature as important drivers, and then mapped risk for subalpine fir distributions. The reds indicate areas of higher risk, The blues and grays indicate lower risks. And so you can see in the northern Rockies and Cascades, subalpine fir is thought to be high in terms of risk, but as in the southern part of its range, the subalpine fir is estimated here to be at lower risk. I worked with Gina Davis, Laura Lowry, and others. Those folks are U.S. Forest Service entomologists to look at this insect at 28 different field sites in Idaho. Gina and Laura and others have measured the balsam woolly adelgid populations and damage at these sites at several time periods. Unfortunately, they did not have annual measurements of the insect, just every 5 to 10 years. And so I was brought in to look at some of the climate influences. And so I used average climate, unfortunately not annual climate, which would have been better, but that's the data we had. I looked at some simple analysis, which is illustrated here, as well as some statistical analysis, and basically found little influence of climate. Nothing really popped out at us. The illustration here is I was plotting summer temperatures versus annual precipitation. The 28 sites are indicated by the 2-letter codes, and these sites are colored according to the fraction of trees with this insect present. So if you focus on greens, oranges, yellows, and reds, those are the sites with the highest amount of balsam woolly adelgid. You can see there's really no relationship that there's balsam woolly adelgid at warmer, wetter, warmer, drier, and so on, all the different areas. We also tested the climate risk index that I mentioned in the previous slide, finding no correlation. So we're really uncertain about what the climate influence is. There should be an influence, we think, but at least with these data, it was hard to pull out. So I'll just give some thoughts that I've had about challenges for producing future projections based on the statistical and mechanistic models that I've been involved with. The first is, not surprisingly, these are complex systems with multiple influences, not just limited to climate, but also something about trees and stands. These processes influence both the insect and the host. So those are challenges. As I mentioned, climate can influence in multiple ways, which makes identification of one particular way sometimes challenging, but often in opposing ways, and that also leads to challenges. We have field and lab experiments for some of these insects, and those have provided very useful information about one or a few processes. But there are challenges because they don't, of course, consider the full extent of an outbreak in the field and the landscape. And also they're very limited. We don't have good experiments for many insects. And we also have limited historical data for both diagnosing mechanisms, as I indicated today, but also to testing predictive models. So that is a major challenge. So to summarize and conclude, I showed you that climate is usually a driver of these forest insect outbreaks in the Western US, but it's often not the only driver, and sometimes it's not even the most important driver. In general, we think that climate change is facilitating these changes in forest insects through warming and sometimes through drying. And those are being manifested today in terms of range expansion, in terms of greater severity of outbreaks, more mortality, and as well as the extent. I showed you that significant uncertainty remains about some important insects. We have some confidence about some insects, but for many, we don't have enough information. And we can do some simple projections. Warmer and drier conditions likely lead to greater extent, et cetera. So, but if we want to be a little more quantitative than that, we need more models, more test some models, and those can be challenging, as I've mentioned, and as a result, producing credible projections can also be challenging, at least quantitatively. So with that, I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Thanks, Jeff. Any questions from the floor? Tracy?
Jeff, my question is related to kind of the interactions between some of these big factors. And the reason I ask is in tree fruit, and specifically in apple trees, which we work in, we see this toggling between waterlogged trees and drought. And with that kind of stress, we're seeing these outbreaks of ambrosia beetles that we haven't had in the past. And so I guess my question is, could it be some key interactions leading to stress on the trees that are leading to some of these big outbreaks?
I'm not exactly sure what your question is, so I'll answer a question that that I want to answer, and you can tell me if that's the question you asked. So drought is the major influence on host trees. Let me back up and be more general. Resource stress, and that it means that stands that have a lot of trees that are denser, where trees are competing for resources, principally water, those are susceptible. But also the interannual variability of drought is most important. And usually in the West, trees are not so waterlogged. Of course, that depends on their position in the landscape, but typically it's drier conditions that stress trees and lead to these major outbreaks. So I'm not sure exactly what you meant by interactions. Did that answer?
If there was some other, it's just something that we talk about a lot, and I was just curious if it ever comes up, this kind of toggling between drought and waterlogging.
Within a season.
Yeah, within a season. Yeah.
That's possibly important, but has really yet to be demonstrated.
Okay.
I would say that, yeah, there is an interaction often between a bark beetle that comes in on stressed trees that are stressed by another agent, whether it's disease or defoliation. So that is a biotic interaction that's known, but not well studied or understood.
Jeff, what you're describing really seems to fit with the situation in the Black Hills in South Dakota, where mountain pine beetle and Ips beetle really came in and did a lot of damage when the populations of the trees became so abnormally dense from what they had been historically. So it created another water deficit, which was then exacerbated by following drought. And so you've got multiple stressors. My rudimentary understanding of those beetles is that stressed trees are attractive to those beetles. Is that correct? In general?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So they do have pheromones that they can begin to sample trees and are attracted to trees that are stressed and less able to defend themselves. And so they send out pheromone signals that attract other insects to help overcome the defenses of trees. So yes, that is correct. They can sample those stressed trees. But also an interesting thing I'll just mention is that at high populations, several of these beetles species can kill healthy trees. So once populations get high enough, relief from drought or relief from other stress matters less, and beetles can move across a landscape after the drought is relieved, which is good news for the beetles, bad news for the trees, I guess.
Go to Neil, and then Glenn online, and then over to Mike.
Yeah, hi, Jeff. Neil McRoberts, UC Davis. I think it was the Western beetle, the Western pine beetle. Anyway, the figures you were showing where you said you were struggling to see a pattern between the temporal matchup of drought and mortality. Have you tried looking at lagged cross correlation effects in that data set?
Yeah, the way that's represented is not necessarily lagged, but summed over multiple years. So what I showed, of course, was just the year of the drought versus the year of mortality. But what I'm looking at also is the current year drought conditions plus last year, or the current year plus the last 2 years. And that accumulation of drought stress over time may actually be important, but it seems to be important in some instances, but not in other instances. So I'm trying to account for that, but it does seem to be inconsistent, if you will, among outbreaks.
Okay, thanks.
Len, you want to jump on and ask your question, or shall I read it?
I'll try to ask it. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, Jeff, good talk. I was just wondering about the, those forest pests that are normally cyclically controlled by natural enemies, whether you've looked at the impacts and the interactions with those natural enemies, like in the case of Western spruce budworm, parasitoids are often considered the main mortality factor, and similarly predators for balsam woolly adelgids.
So yes, you mentioned two. I wasn't actually aware that natural enemies control balsam woolly adelgid populations, so that's interesting. Certainly, the natural enemies of defoliators seem to be controlling their populations, but that doesn't appear to be the case for bark beetles for whatever reason. And so we don't need to think about natural enemies in those instances.
Right. Okay.
Mike Huffman speaking. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay.
So for the species that are clearly made worse by climate change, is the problem global? And secondly, what does this mean to global carbon sequestration with all these millions of acres of trees dying?
Western North America seems to be a hot spot for tree mortality, at least widespread tree mortality. But there's been several studies that have collated reports of tree mortality, and those have been fairly widespread, I think, on almost every continent and in almost every forest type. So some effect of either drought and or biotic agents seem to be killing trees across forests. With respect to the carbon cycle, that's a little tricky because these forests typically will recover. They actually have a pretty good head start compared to, for instance, wildfires, because the insects that are killing are host specific. They're often age specific. And so the forests can recover, well, maybe within a few decades. And of course, what that means is that the carbon that's released by the killed trees is then going to be recovered eventually. That doesn't help with today's atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And so, yeah, these mortality agents will lead to additional inputs of atmospheric CO2 or CO2 into the atmosphere.
All right, I think we will go ahead and move on. Thank you, John.